Hey there, welcome back to the Great Canadian Blueprint. I'm Ian, your guide through Canada's economic past, and today we're diving into a story of regional disparity, the maritime economic lag, with a focus on how the national policy's tariffs hit Nova Scotia hard. Picture Halifax in the late 1800s, bustling port, but not keeping pace with the industrial boom of Toronto or Montreal. The national policy, launched in 1879, was meant to unify Canada, bringing its economy together. But it left the Maritimes, especially Nova Scotia, struggling to keep up. As a REMAX real estate agent from Hamilton, Ontario, I'm diving into Canada's economic history and how it shaped our great nation. Let's set the stage. In 1879, John A. Macdonald's Conservative government rolled out the national policy, a bold plan to build a strong Canadian economy. The centerpiece? High tariffs, 10 to 30% on imported manufacturing goods like textiles, machinery, and iron products. The goal was to protect Canada's young industries from cheap American imports, which were flooding the market. In 1878, Canada imported $57 million in manufactured goods, mostly from the US, while exporting just $12 million. The tariffs aimed to boost local production, create jobs, and make Canada self-sufficient. For central Canada, Ontario and Quebec, this was a game changer. Factories in Toronto and Montreal thrived, producing goods without American competition. But for Nova Scotia and the Maritimes, the story was different. Their economy leaned heavily on primary industries: fishing, forestry, shipbuilding, and some agriculture. These sectors were more about exporting to markets like the US and the Caribbean than competing in domestic manufacturing. Initially, these tariffs did give a boost. Between 1882 and 1885, 6 cotton textile plants opened in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. On top of that, sugar refineries popped up in Halifax, Moncton, and Dartmouth. The Nova Scotia Steel Company, founded in 1881 in New Glasgow, grew steadily, and other industries like iron and steel saw gains. In the 1880s, the Maritimes industrial expansion outpaced central Canada by 15%, with manufacturing output rising from 37% to 48% of total production. But here's the catch. This boom didn't last. The Maritimes manufacturing sector was small and less efficient than central Canada's. On top of that, when the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed in 1885, it opened a direct route from Montreal to the Maritimes, flooding the region with cheaper goods from Ontario and Quebec. Local industries just couldn't compete. By the 1890s, manufacturing growth in the Maritimes slowed to 4%, while Ontario hit 21% and Quebec 30%. The labor force in manufacturing grew by just 0.3% from 1891 to 1911, compared to 1.5% in central Canada. Factories like the St. John Cotton Mill collapsed, and many maritime businesses were bought out by central Canadian firms, like the Dominion Cotton Mills Company in 1891. The tariffs also made life more expensive. Imported goods like tools, machinery, and clothing cost more, hitting consumers and businesses hard. Nova Scotia's economy, reliant on trade, felt the pinch. Before 1879, the Maritimes thrived under the 1854 Reciprocity Treaty with the US, which allowed free trade in natural resources like fish and lumber. When it ended in 1866, trade suffered. The national policy's tariffs didn't help. The Maritimes wanted free trade, as seen in their support for reciprocity in the 1911 election, but voters nationally rejected it, fearing US economic dominance. By the 1920s, the Maritimes' economic growth was just 0.3%, compared to Canada's 6.1%, with output per worker 20 to 30% below the national average. This economic lag hit Halifax real estate market hard. As Nova Scotia's largest city, Halifax was a hub for trade and industry, but it couldn't match the explosive growth of central Canadian cities. From 1881 to 1901, Halifax's population grew from 36,000 to just over 40,000, a modest 13% increase. Compare that to Toronto, which more than doubled from 96,000 to over 200,000, and Montreal, which also experienced a 90% rise in population. This slow population growth for the East meant less demand for housing, leading to a stagnant real estate market. Before 1879, Halifax saw steady development. Earlier, from 1841 to 1871, its population doubled from 15,000 to nearly 30,000, with new neighborhoods like the South Suburbs and speculative housing projects. Lots on streets like Queen and Pleasant sold briskly, but after 1879, growth slowed. By 1901, Halifax added only about 4,700 residents, while Toronto added over 113,000. With less demand, new construction lagged and property values grew modestly compared to central Canada's booming markets. The economic downturn also meant less investment in Halifax. While Toronto and Montreal built skyscrapers and suburbs, Halifax's development was conservative, focusing on maintaining its role as a port and military base. The lack of industrial dynamism kept the housing market sluggish, reflecting Nova Scotia's broader economic challenges. The national policy aimed to create a unified Canada. So, how did other provinces support the Maritimes? Central Canada, Ontario and Quebec, provided a market for maritime resources like fish, lumber, and coal. In the 1890s, Nova Scotia exported $4 million in fish and $1.5 million in lumber annually, much of it to central Canada. The federal government also invested in infrastructure, like the Intercolonial Railway, completed in 1876, which linked Halifax to Quebec, facilitating trade. Federal subsidies supported industries like the Nova Scotia Steel Company, boosting local production. However, this support was a double-edged sword. The Intercolonial Railway and later the CPR allowed central Canadian manufacturers to dominate the maritime markets, undermining local industries. The Maritimes became economically dependent, buying more manufactured goods from Ontario and Quebec than they sold in return, which deepened regional disparities. Despite this economic lag, the Maritimes were vital to Canada's growth. Their natural resources fueled the national economy. In the 1890s, Nova Scotia's fish exports, worth $4 million annually, fed Canadian and international markets, while Cape Breton's coal-powered central Canadian steel mills. The maritime shipbuilding industry, centered in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, produced wooden sailing ships that carried Canadian goods globally, with Halifax as a key hub. Halifax's strategic port was a cornerstone of Canada's defense and trade. During the American Civil War, it served as a British naval base, and later during World Wars I and II, it was critical for convoys and military operations. The Maritimes also contributed financially, with Halifax-based banks like the Bank of Nova Scotia, founded in 1832, becoming national institutions. The national policy's tariffs were a mixed bag for Nova Scotia. They sparked a brief manufacturing boom, but ultimately favored central Canada, leaving the Maritimes economically dependent and lagging. Halifax's stagnant housing market reflected this, with slow growth compared to booming central Canadian cities. Yet the Maritimes supported Canada through resources, shipbuilding, and strategic ports. So here's my question. Did the national policy unfairly sideline the Maritimes? Or was it a necessary step to Canada's growth? Drop your thoughts below. Thanks for watching the Great Canadian Blueprint. Hit like and subscribe for our next dive into Canada's economic story.